All right, I'd like to get started with just a few comments, and then we'll let the discussion and presentation begin. So we will be using the chat and raise hand features of Zoom for clarifying questions during the question, but you're also able to hold questions at the end. Federiga said she's also comfortable with people speaking up if you feel like that is appropriate as well. We have enabled subtitles and the ability to view a live transcript. If you utilize the CC button at the bottom of the screen, you can view the live transcript or turn on or off the subtitles if needed. I wanted to note that we are recording this meeting. We do appreciate being able to see each other, but we also understand that some people need to have their cameras off for a variety of reasons. And so we want you to feel comfortable with either option. If you would like to rename yourself and include your pronouns, please do so. And if you need help with that, please privately chat me and I can help with that. And then I just want to conclude with the statement that is traditional for us. As we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to these lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homeland of indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewardship, recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples and also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems of indigenous peoples that they have developed in relations to these lands. And with that, I will turn it over to Karu for an introduction.
Great, thank you, Cindy, for getting us started. And as always, thanks to Fernando and Cindy for helping coordinate this speaker series. Really happy to see everybody here, and thanks for joining us on this gorgeous, gorgeous day. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Federiga Bindi here with us today. She's a professor at the University of Rome, but much to our good fortune at the Institute of Behavioral Science has decided to relocate to Boulder. So she's here in person and is the newest member of the program on international development. So we're very, very happy to have her joining the community here at the Institute of Behavioral Science. She's an expert on EU politics, and I just really encourage everyone to take a quick look. Just Google her. She's written 8 books on a variety of topics in EU politics and foreign policy. She's been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute and the Carnegie Endowment, among many other kind of amazing locations and institutions. And today we are very lucky to have her talk to us about foreign policy at the time of COVID after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So very timely topic. And Federiga, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Marion, for having me over, and Fernando and Cindy for organizing this. And as Carrie said, I am originally from Italy. I spent almost 13 years in Washington, D.C., first at the Brookings Institution, then at SAIS, bit of teaching at EU, Carnegie, the stint of North Carolina, and then we were very ready to leave the East Coast, and we relocated in Boulder a year ago, and we feel very, very fortunate to be here, and even more so to be able to hopefully meet you all guys soon in person. So as Carrie said, I am in theory a scholar. Do you mind if I see that? Oh, okay, why is it? I'm a scholar of European affairs. I'm trying to do the view where I see your faces rather than mine. Okay, right, that's better, even if you have the pictures on. And I am my original area of expertise was actually EU decision making. I studied how member states influence the EU decision-making procedures. And then when I came to the US, nobody really cared about that. And my boss, which was then Benjamin at the time at Brookings, was like, oh, you know, we would we are really interested in a new thing, which is the EU foreign policy. The Lisbon Treaty was about to be signed and then to enter into force at the end of 2009. And Brookings and mind you that many of my colleagues were supposed and actually went into the Obama administration, were interested in knowing more about how this EU foreign policy would work, and I'll tell you about a little bit more about that. And so he asked me to study that and write about that, and it was actually my great fortune, because the EU foreign policy has been a book which has had a lot of success in the field, at least, and we're now gonna come out with the 3rd edition. So I do hope to have a book launch at the CU and IBS as well soon, at the beginning of next year. So anyway, I slowly transitioned from EU policymaking to EU foreign policy, and in particular transatlantic relations. But then, as any of us who is in foreign policy, I actually look at the larger picture. So the weird thing is that because I lived in the US so long, I actually went to do my biometrics the other day for the first step towards citizenship. And I had this mixed nature. I use we. I go by she and her, by the way. But when I talk about EU or US foreign policy, I tend to use we in both cases. I tend to say we when we talk about Europe, and we one is about the US, which is a bit schizophrenic. I understand, or they in both cases, but whatever. And before I start, feel free to come in anytime, to stop me, raise your hand in talk. I understand you're all either colleagues or junior colleagues, grad students. And so it's, as I said, my main focus is transatlantic relations. As I said, when I was at Brookings in 2008, 2009, Brookings was really serving as the EU foreign policy go-to for Obama, because as you remember, when Obama got into office, his foreign policy experience was very limited, which I assume it was among the reasons why he chose Joe Biden as his vice president. And Brookings really made everything for him. And for instance, if you look at Afghanistan today, what happened in Afghanistan in the past months or two is really a direct consequence of what Brookings and Bruce Riddell at the time pushed for at the time, because and we will go back into that, but if you remember, Obama campaigned on a position that he wanted to end the war, and then once he got elected, several of my colleagues, Bruce in first, were like, oh no, you don't want to get out, this is the most, and Mike Hallinan and many others are like, oh no, this is the mother of all wars, we want to be there, we actually want to create a new search, right, which was written by Bruce. And I think that was, frankly, the biggest and one of the two major mistakes of the Obama presidency, together with the Middle East mess. All right. But before we go into that, I want to go back a little bit into transatlantic relations. So as I said, they were very interested in understanding what this EU foreign policy was. As you may know, or you may remember, the European communities and then the European Union tried several times to create a European foreign policy. They started with the European Defense Community in 1954. That failed, so defense became sort of a taboo. NATO, Western European Union got powers, and basically defense was in the hands of NATO, which for Europeans was very convenient because they had the protection, they didn't have to spend for defense, they could invest on their social welfare, while substantially the Americans paid for it. But the Americans were also happy because, they had a strong presence in Europe, which would guarantee them against the communist powers, but also would guarantee that their hands on European countries' policymaking would be, and their influence would be very, very strong. And so things went a little bit like this. Then when Germany, who is one of today's news, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, Germany reunified, right? And for those of you who are my age, you might remember that. The younger ones may not remember that, but at the time it was like, at the beginning, it was like, whoa, November 9th, 1989 is somehow the equivalent than 9/11. You know, everybody in the US remembers where they were on 9/11. Everybody in Europe of my age class remember where we were on November 9th, 1989. And I remember at the time I was an exchange student. I was a foreign student in Sciences Po, Paris. And we had a big lecture in the amphitheater, which is huge room, by a free Grosser, and Grosser was about 5 to 7. He was finished his lecture and saying, and maybe in 20 years, the communist regime will come down. And in that moment, we had the operators, the people who were staying at the door, and they came in, rushed in and said, we just came to tell you that the Berlin Wall fell down. And I still have goosebumps. I mean, that was totally unexpected. You have to think that Europe was divided into 2 parts. Unless you were a high-ranking member of the Communist Party, you never had been on the eastern part of Europe. You had no idea. You know, I remember going in there, one of the first youth delegation in March 1990. I was like, oh, wow, they have microwaves woven. Oh, wow, they have 2 legs and 2 arms. That was really, you know, wow, they have very little, but they're very similar to us, right? It was huge. It was really huge. The end of artificial division, but also somehow the beginning of current problems with Europe. Because I remember when I started teaching, I'm afraid a quarter century ago, and we were talking about 11/9 with my students. And of course they remembered, they referred to it with the expression, the day we won the Cold War. I'm like, no, we don't use that expression. We say the day the Berlin Wall came down, right? And then when I came to the US, I realized that my students were using an expression which is fairly widespread, right? And if you saw in the European acception of the word, if the fall of the Berlin Wall is the end of a national division, but if you say that this is winning the Cold War, it means there's a winner and there is a loser. And the US clearly perceives itself as the winner, from which a right duty to become the world superpower came from, at the same time as when the USSR collapsed and disintegrated, giving birth to a number of new countries. And so in the same time where the new Russia was really, really very weak, right? So this fundamentally different interpretation of 11/9 affected the way we looked at foreign policy in the US and Europe for years to come up to today, and affected the way each part looked at each other. And this here, the idea that the Cold War was won and therefore the US was the main foreign power, it's the truth is shared by both Democrats and Republicans. Both sides believe that. And for instance, is one of the reasons why when during the first Gulf War, we did not get into Baghdad. You know, they were part of hardliner, both in the hawks, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I said, what? We are the biggest superpower in the war, and we're not getting into Baghdad. We're not finishing this. And that in turn will lead to George W. leading the next war to Iraq, which was another huge mistake. But we will go to that. So this is the different interpretation of that date. And then at the same time, you know, with German reunifying, Kohl made very clear that he would reunify the country. And everybody was like, you know, and Mitterrand, which was then the president of France, invited everybody for dinner a few days afterwards. It was at the end of the week at Élysée to discuss what to do, the other heads of government and state. And, you know, it was, Mitterrand knew how to host people and good food and alcohol and everything. Everybody, including Mrs. Thatcher, was like, yeah, we need to approve German reunification. And then I went back home and the alcohol wiped off, and it was like, oh, no, we don't want this. So, but Kohl himself was aware of the risk of German reunification. So him and Mitterrand, with the help of essentially the Christian Democrats, but not only leaders from Italy and the Benelux, you know, they decided that there should be German reunification, but in exchange, or at the same time of the stronger Europe. And this is how the European Union was created, replacing and absorbing the European communities we had until that point. And the EU would have two things. It would have a single currency, which eventually became the euro, and would have a common foreign defense policy, right? And I will spare all the negotiation, but if you have questions about the negotiation, that's one of the fun parts I really studied and enjoyed. But long story short, economic and monetary union came into being, and foreign and defense, most of all, only partially so, especially defense. You know, at the same time, George W. went into, during the negotiation, went into Iraq. That divided the Europeans, especially the French and the British, and that made the whole EU defense collapse again. And so we will have to go until the Lisbon Treaty to actually start talking about that. Foreign policy was an embryo of foreign policy. And as from December 2009, this EU foreign policy, EU high representative was set to start, and it did. And this is why the new American administration was interested. And Obama, differently from his predecessor, was really not an Eastern person. His focus, as we know, more on pivot to Asia and this part. So it was rather agnostic. So he dispatched Phil Gordon, who also was a former colleague at Brookings, and he was Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. Phil went on a tour of the capitals and essentially asked the capitals, what are we going to do with this? Are we going to talk on bilateral with you, or are we going to talk directly to the EU foreign policy person, right? And I was in one of those meetings because I was at the same time advising the Italian foreign minister, and we had the meeting with the minister, and Frattini was like, oh yeah, you know, this is very important, you know, your foreign policy is going to be the fora for us, blah, blah, blah. And then we go in the meeting only with the diplomats, and the diplomats were, no. Nope, it's not going to be like this. Actually, you need to continue talking on bilateral. We are the masters, and so on and so forth. So the European member states undermined European foreign policy since day one. And they're still doing that. And in doing so, they lost a huge opportunity. Because at the end of the day, the European member states are small little dots in the global scenario, right? So Obama was like, forget. He did not even attend the Madrid Council because the Europeans were fighting each other on who would receive him. Would he be the president of the European Council? Would be the president of the Commission? He said, you know what? That's it. I'm not coming. They had a EU-US bilateral in Lisbon alongside NATO, and NATO, you know, somehow got revived, got a new headquarters, got involved outside of its national borders, and was seemingly living happily ever after. Questions up to here, by the way. No, seemingly living happily ever after until when Trump arrived, right? And so the Europeans, much like most of DC, I don't know how the feeling was in here in Colorado, but where it was at the time in North Carolina, to me, was clear that Trump would have won. But when I was going back for the weekends in DC, my friends were like, oh, no, he's gonna lose, right? So the European, much like the Washington bubble, thought, oh, he could never win. We put all their chips on Hillary. Then Trump won. I was like, disbelief. But then I was like, oh, you know, it doesn't really matter. This is going to soon be business as usual. And they believed so. So that then a new EU high rep came to Washington and, you know, talked to Pence. But it took them a lot of time to understand that it was not business as usual, right? And that offered a unique opportunity again for the Europeans to wake up and update their foreign and defense policy. And they did create what is called PESCO, P-E-S-C-O, which is basically an enhanced cooperation in defense, among whoever you want, who wants, but for which we had lots of expectation. But even that went really into the forgetful. And before I forgot because I went straight into Trump. But I mentioned Middle East before. So Middle East, it's interesting because the Arab Spring was not foreseen by any analyst. You know, and you put that together in Afghanistan and everything, you really ask what the analysts are doing, but whatever. And that includes us in many cases, I'm afraid to say, and was really badly managed. And the worst part was Libya, which again, I saw from above the standpoint of the analyst, of a scholar, but also on government. And Libya was a huge mistake. Many European countries did not want to join. Many did not join. For instance, Germany, they refused to even allow their bases to be used. But others, like my home country, Italy, was dragged into the war. You know, Hillary at the time was a Secretary of State. She dispatched John Kerry, who was the EU. He was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There was lots of pressure on Berlusconi. There was lots of pressure on everyone. There was lots of pressure on the President of the Republic, Napolitano, which in Italy has a very honorific title and role, but he was heavily dragged into that. And the pressure was really, Berlusconi offered to act as an intermediary with Gaddafi. And for that crazy that may seem, he may have had a chance at negotiating with him. You may want to remember that Gaddafi gave up his weapons, his lethal weapons, a nuclear weapon, in change of a treaty, which Italy signed up. And Libya used to be the colonizer of Libya. So this friendship treaty included reparations for the colonies, included lots of things, which the other Europeans who also had colonies were not really happy about. The whole process, I mean, I loved what Cindy said about the Native Americans tribes before. That process about colonization in Europe mostly still has to start. Europeans still have to fully acknowledge their responsibilities in colonization and the damage they did, so that the country acknowledged that and agreed on reparation was something that some of the countries, especially France and England, who were the first one to attack Libya, were really, really not happy to see. So all things together, the attack took place. The lesson that you know, totalitarian leader learn is never give up your weapons and never trust democracies, because if you do, then you are unable to respond. And of course, it created lots of instability in the area. It's still a failed state. Lots of illegal immigration, so lots of pressure on Europe. So overall, Libya was a huge disaster. And to me, it's interesting because if you talk to the people who were in power at the time, we're like, oh, Libya is a perfect example of transatlantic cooperation. You know, we provided the bombs but they did the dirty work. And to me, is as an analyst, but also as someone who was in policy at the time, is the ultimate example of failed cooperation and the worst action ever. So going back into Trump, you know, the Europeans are like, oh, it's going to go business as usual. That didn't happen. And so when Biden was finally elected, Europeans are like, yeah, business as usual. Again, we are there. But the times have changed. And while Biden is a convinced transatlanticist, all his story is about that. And, you know, his personal, you know, he comes from Ireland, which, as you may know, his first call to a foreign leader was to the Irish Prime Taoiseach. Transatlantic relations are not the core business of this country anymore. And if you look at the choreography of his visit to Europe, that is very interesting because he first calls the Irish Taoiseach before he calls Johnson, British Prime Minister. Very clear sign. It's like, I'm not gonna let, you know, that the agreement, the Easter agreements on Ireland are on shaky grounds now with Brexit, but that was a very clear signal to Johnson. I'm not gonna let Ireland slip through the cracks. But then when he actually goes to Europe, the first person he sees is Johnson. And then he meets with NATO, G8, sorry, first meets with the G7, then he goes to Brussels, meets with NATO, and then last he meets with the EU. So the message is really very clear if you want to read it. And also if you look at what came out, for instance, of the various meetings, it's a lot of blah, blah, blah. But the one issue on which Biden was not able to get the Europeans on board is the most important issue, which is China. The Europeans are deeply divided on China. They still see it as a major, most of them still see it as a major trade partner. And they don't want to go along with the US on hitting on China, which means they're missing a lot of trains. And the AUKUS submarine thing signals two things in my and the US, UK, Australia alliance signal two things. First of all, the shift towards not considering Europe the most important issue in US foreign policy is confirmed. You know, that's a trend that started with Obama, worsened it with Trump, and is confirmed by Biden. So there is continuity there. Secondly, Afghanistan also confirms that, because there was, my understanding, there was extremely little cooperation on that. Now, secondly, I think there is a problem in communication, which is linked to COVID. So the major problem with COVID was that were two. First of all, every country really had to mind their own business, right? So China could do whatever they wanted, others could do whatever they wanted, and nobody really cared because they were focused on battling COVID. But also that we got less used to interpersonal relations. In diplomacy, interpersonal relations are the bulk, are the most important things. Trust and interpersonal relations. They can, when I studied decision-making, for instance, decision-making, that ability of the leaders to talk to each other directly, personally, to solve problems in small groups was fundamental for decision to be made and to go forward, right? And both AUKUS and both the way AUKUS and Afghanistan were dealt with signals that we haven't gotten out of this COVID way of dealing with things, that, you know, we don't really communicate the way we did. And that's understandable because, you know, you communicate on platform like Zoom or even more secure ones, you always had the risk that someone interferes with that. So that's a major problem. You know, we have to go back to doing diplomacy in interpersonal way if we want to be somehow effective. The other consequence of both AUKUS and Afghanistan, in my mind, is that NATO is brain dead. This is something that French President Macron had been saying for a while. And despite having a brand new headquarters, very expensive new headquarters, NATO is brain dead. Going out of its area was a big mistake. And I really can't see a future for NATO, which is somehow meaningful, you know, in going forward. And the last consequence of Afghanistan is Western world credibility. Right, I went into Afghanistan 10 years ago, 11 years 12 years ago. 12 years ago. I was charged, at the time I was charged to design and lead the trainings for young Afghan civil servants and diplomats. And first of all, I had to lead a battle with the foreign ministry to convince them to allow me and the president of the National School of Administration with whom we did this to go to Afghanistan. You know, I said, I need to go to the country, understand their needs. Otherwise I can't design a proper educational, 3 months model, right? And they were like, oh, no. We have these things done for the Iraqi, you can use them. And I'm like, no, because the society, the socioeconomic features of society are so different. You can't really use the same thing we did with Iraq, which was a secular society for Afghanistan, which is clearly not. And I also wanted to negotiate a number of things. But from the visit myself and Giovanni did in Afghanistan, Giovanni was the president of the National School of Administration, it was clear that Afghanistan was going to fail, right? Everybody made themselves look good by saying, oh, we are in Afghanistan, we're doing this, we're doing that. But first of all, there was no coordination whatsoever. So we all trained groups of people and we didn't know what the others were doing. It was completely uncoordinated. And this showed when we got out because we didn't know how to reach the people, right? The people who we trained, the people who we work with, and who we needed to take out of the country. As several of my former students, if you want to call them, who are in hiding at the moment. And I was not able to get them out. Italy preferred to get out the women football players, which, it's important, but these people were trained by us and they put by us into jeopardy. But we simply did not. I had people reaching out to me and said, we need to reach out to them. And it's like, yeah, I have some of them, but I don't have them all, right? Secondly, the strategy that the US employed with Afghanistan was to send in some very, very well-paid civil servants, very, very paid, not even civil servants, advisors, some of Afghanistan descent, and pay them zillions of dollars to do the work for the Afghanis, essentially. And we well know that if you teach someone, if you have a hungry person, you give them the fish they eat for one day. If you teach them how to fish, the fish for the rest of their life, and what the many countries, including the Americans, did was basically give them lots of fish and teach them very little how to fish. So 12 years ago, it was clear that Afghanistan would have been a failure, and 12 more years passed and didn't change that. However, and the way the Taliban were able to regain the whole country in a much easier way than last time shows that, we really didn't build anything whatsoever there. And it's not true that we were not doing peace building, because we were doing peace building and institution building. So whenever President Biden said, oh, we never did that, it's like, no, we were there 20 years for that. That's not true. And the other big consequence is Western world, Western values, democracy, human rights, whatever, lost any credibility. As a whole, the Western world lost any credibility. I hope that the Summit on Democracy will not be held, because I don't see how we can say we are going to run a summit on democracy. We don't have the moral authority to do that anymore. I was listening to NPR yesterday. Humanitarian missions were authorized into Afghanistan. The sending of humanitarian help was authorized. And while that is needed, doing that while we have news from Herat and other cities that people were hanged, to showcase them, that people had their arms amputated, this really gives a further mixed message, right? So what worries me the most is that loss of credibility. As someone who came into the US and chose to become a citizen, the moral attractiveness of the US is huge. and they don't think it's properly understood abroad. You know, even today, I think it's just like, oh, wow, you are so lucky. So people look up at the US as a moral beacon, light of moral beacon, and we completely lost that today. And this is really worrying because we don't have reference points anymore going forward. And we are going to go back to a Westphalian system where the only thing that counts is power. And that is really not looking good. And I would stop here. I have more to say, but I would go into questions, comments, and whatever you want. And not biting. Yep, Fernando.
Sorry, I was just clapping. I'm gonna let, unless folks have other questions, I can ask one. So, yeah, so while people gather their thoughts, I guess I will ask one question. Really appreciate your both practical and broader perspective on EU relations, foreign policy. I guess, yeah, I was going to ask this if people didn't ask questions, too many questions, because it might be a little bit off field, left field. But
you're happy, but I'm happy for you to go off field. Don't worry. Okay,
so you know, I've been reading a little bit about. I study immigration issues, right? So I've been reading a little bit about asylum policy and how the U.S., Australia, the EU, well, different European nations have tried to skirt some of the their, you know, the jure, right, responsibilities towards allowing people to apply for asylum in different ways, externalizing borders and so on, and how basically that's affected in some ways by different kinds of foreign relations with regards to how sometimes countries push against EU policy, and sometimes EU policy allows them to take cover and not take basically skirt this arguable responsibilities. Anyway, sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. So I guess one of the questions I had was if you see any parallels with regards to how these changing relations with regards to how the US in particular foreign policy has shifted would affect immigration or refugee policy or asylum policy in Europe.
No.
Again, sorry.
So several things. Thank you for the question, which is rather complex. So several things. First of all, immigration issues are managed by, are dealt by in the European Union by the Dublin Convention, which was done in the mid 1990s and is completely out of date today. Okay, and there have been talks of renewing it, of changing it, but it's a very hot topic, possibly the hottest topic of all in Europe at the moment, right? Apart from the Dublin Convention, that is a national issue. So the EU is sort of, is a hybrid, right? It's a federation from some points of view, it's a confederation in some others. So you have a little bit like the US, you know, you have exclusive competencies of the states, exclusive competencies of the, for instance, education is exclusive competence, or exclusive competence of the EU, like trade policy, and hybrid. It's exactly the same as it is in the US. So except for Dublin, the immigration policies are in the hands of the member states. So you do have states like Denmark who say we're not going to take any more refugees, but deal with it, right? And you can have moral suasion or moral pressure on them, but not much more than that. And with the Libya agreement, the main reason why Italy managed signed the Libya Friendship Treaty was exactly to stop illegal immigration. So Italy, as I said, would pay reparation, would build infrastructure, and change. The Libya border police would stop immigration at the border, right? And it did work really well. But the moment Libya fails as a state, as it's gone, right? So it's no man's land. And then the way Europe tried to stop it was to give lots of money to Turkey and say, you keep them, we pay you, you keep them, which in turn gave lots of leverage to Turkey, to an increasingly more authoritarian leader who can blackmail Europe on that and say, you know what, I'm going to open the border. And he has been doing that at times, you know, opening the border or pushing people to go over to Greece, and the Europeans like, hey! And even with Afghanistan, you know, the whole thing was collapsing. These people, I mean, there are people who are gonna die or are dead because of what we did. And though the Europeans could think of was like, oh, we don't want more refugees. I was like, really, people? That's shame on you, right? That's really shame on you. So it's awful. I had a student who did a very interesting and very sad thesis this year. She retraced her sister actually worked in a camp. So she had access to primary sources. It's in English. I can send it to you, Fernando, if you want. And she retraced the story of a Syrian girl who escaped with her aunt and ended up in Greece. She escaped with her aunt because her sister or brother were not well, so they couldn't endure the travel. And it took her 3 years to get into Holland. And she has art sensibilities, so she designed what she felt. And I can share everything with you. It's really, really interesting, all the designs as well. She's going to publish it. It's heartbreaking, you know. And when they get in these camps in Greece, there is no health, there is no education. So she missed 3 years of education. There's nothing really. And the best camps were run by NGOs by the beach until when they were dismantled. So thinking that Europe is a continent that as a whole sent so many immigrants along the centuries abroad. They came to America, they went to South America, they went to Canada, they went to Australia, and so on and so forth. The way we deal with immigrants, it's really shameful. And we don't want them. And if you think a bit about it, numbers, the absolute numbers may seem a lot, but the relative numbers are really, really little, right? So it's shameful, but it's probably one of the things on which every leader agrees. We don't want more refugees. And again, it goes back to the issue of we are supposed to lead by example because we are democracies, we believe in human rights and blah, blah, blah. And for instance, in the EU foreign policy, the EU aid development policy, it has lots of conditionalities, right? It has been very successful for many years, but they have lots of string attached. We're going to give you money, but you do this and this and this for human rights, which also explains why China could get into those countries in Africa, especially, and say, oh, we give you money, no string attached, or supposedly so, because the strings are even worse. You know, it's the debt. But at first, it doesn't look like. But you know, I don't think we are able to do this unless we lead by example. And the refugees, it's really one area where we don't lead by example. And to me also, and I go to the US, has been interesting. You know, I'm all in all these Facebook groups, whatever, for women in foreign policy, what give you. And everybody was like, oh, you know, the Afghani, we need to help the Afghani here in the US, not in Europe really, but here in the US, everybody, I mean, all these groups were taken over by we need to help Afghanistan. Everyone I know has scrambled to help someone, right? Because everyone I know somehow have worked in Afghanistan some way or the other. But then you have a crisis with the Haitians at the Texan border. It's like, really? Oh yeah, they are at our border, so we don't really want them. Right? These are far away, perceived far away, so we want to help them. It's a major contradiction. And it's going to stay in the Biden presidency, I'm afraid. But in terms of, sorry, I didn't actually respond to your question. In terms of the influence of the shifts on Europe, no, the influence was really the mismanagement of Middle East. That is what created the crisis for Europe. What is happening today, you know, we are not going to solve the Syria. We're not. I mean, this is status quo. It's going to be status quo until people will eventually forget, and we are gonna give it up, and Assad is going to go back to his power. Yemen creates some refugees. So if the US is able to effectively stop the war there, that would help, but it's just a minority of them. There will be more coming from Afghanistan, but again, there's little the US can do on that at that point. Yes, policy had consequence in the sense that there will be more Afghans, but most of these people, it will take them 2 or 3 years to get to the European borders. You know, many are stuck in Iran, many are stuck in Pakistan, many are stuck in Tajikistan. So there is a consequence of the US actions, but the effort will come in a while.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, reactions?
Yep, Trent.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I guess I have 2 questions, one practical, one sort of bigger picture. First, does AUKUS specifically make France's electing somebody like Marine Le Pen more or less likely in the coming year? And then 2, maybe more, does the sort of communication channels that COVID has required, does that sort of prove, you know, Carl Schmitt right? Are liberal democratic politics doomed to the extent that they depend on a politics of having an enemy? And, you know, in that world, you know, we can't tell who is enemy and who is friend reliably if we don't have the in-person diplomatic aspect.
So 2 important questions. So AUKUS, that's a good question, actually. She was certainly going to exploit it. At the moment, the whole France is like, yeah, you know, and Europe, I mean, it's general outrage, right? So yes, it could help her. Though if you look at the German elections and previous election we have had, extremists are not gaining. COVID is not helping them. And so the extreme right in Germany went back. Yes, they still have 2 digits, but they went back. They didn't have a success they expected to be. At the end of the day, what COVID is, at least for the moment, showing is that center parties, whether it's center left or center right or center left, are the one winning. To my surprise, even the Greens didn't do as well as I thought, as everybody thought, actually. And this is surprising because, you know, I didn't mention it, but the big challenge of tomorrow is climate change. You know, and this is something that if we don't all work together, we're doomed. One of the things I'm really trying to do is bring in Kerry to IBS. I can't promise, but I'm trying hard. And this is the biggest challenge of our generation, and most of all of the younger generations. I mean, this is going to wipe out parts. I was reading this one article on the Washington Post yesterday on Alaska and how the melting of the permafrost is destroying communities, and how the policies in Alaska are very ambivalent towards what to do with it, right? I mean, this is huge. Concerning Carl Schmitt, we do yes and no, in the sense the politics side needs to be ramped up. It's slowly starting. You also have to consider that there has been a ban for almost 2 years on Europeans to come in Europe to the US. So Europeans will only allowed into the US starting November. And so basically didn't have interchange. And even people who had visas. I mean, I know tons of people, scholars, who are on a B1 visa and they were not able to go back home. People who haven't been able to visit their family in 2 years. And some of them went, and something went wrong with the NIE, with the national interest exception, and they're stuck in Europe. I mean, it's a whole mess. I've never was ever so thankful for being on a green card, which allowed me to travel, right? So that human component was really not, because there was this ban, which was frankly at the end little understandable, right? The enemy is there because the US has clearly defined its next enemy. The next enemy is China. And I do agree that that is the next enemy, right? The point is that he hasn't, and that also explains the alliance with Australia, because for the Australians, China is a very important challenge and very near in geographical terms, right? The problem here is that the Europeans have not bought it, and they're not buying, and they're not seeing it when all the evidence is there. I mean, the Europeans is like, it's like a fog. It's weird because even when I'm there, it's sort of like there is a fog. Maybe because here in Colorado, and especially here in Boulder, we're so used to the blue skies and crisp air. But it's sort of like, I feel there's this fog and, you know, around the brain as well. It's like, wake up, you know, wake up. And they're not. So one part of alliance has a clear enemy. The other one is like, oh, really? We don't want to do that. And this is infiltrating the US power, right? And even things like, you know, again, when I was listening to the fact that aid will be allowed into Afghanistan, despite what the Taliban are doing, and you don't allow the same aid to go into Iran, that's, if I may use the word, is flatly stupid. Because what you are doing, you open the door for China. But that's the same with Russia. And that was clear 15 years ago already. You know, they have natural resources, Russia and Iran, from which it depend. All right. They either sell to us, the Westerners, or they sell to China. Right. And I remember when I was in government and we went into meeting, every single meeting at whatever then level, it was always, oh, Italy is a net importer from Russia. This is wrong. This is wrong. And I was like, you don't understand. First of all, we need that. But if we stop buying, then Russia sells to China. You're pushing Russia into their hands. And I was in government 2008, 9, 10, 11. Okay, to give you a reference point. So, and that's exactly what happened, the pipeline selling to China. So on the one side, we do have an enemy with this China, but at the same time, we don't use all the tools, or I would rather say we use very few of the tools we have to put pressure on China. So one side we say we are an enemy, but on the other side, I say, oh, all the other policies are actually giving you a wonderful opportunity to go into, to expand your trades and expand your control on the world. You know, even in the US backyard, Latin America, China is expanding its influence at the worryingly rate. So we bottom line, we have an enemy. We need to decide whether we want to work strategically and a coherent way to defeat that enemy, or we want to just go around and mess up and achieve no result whatsoever in the end. Other questions, comments? Silence. You're hungry.
I have to say, my name's Carl.
Where are you? Oh, yeah, I see you. Yep.
I'm surprised to hear you say that the US has lost its moral authority, because when did we ever have it? We started with genocide. We have a history of slavery. We bombed 2 cities of innocence in Japan.
I completely
we ever have that moral authority?
Look, I completely agree with you. And for me, one of the most interesting things is studying US history with my son, right? And we go over and over. This is the first time he's doing US history. And invariably, the view is we won every single war, you know, which is factually not true. You know, starting with Canada and Mexico, actually those wars were lost. We are super kind. And no, actually we had some concentration camps for the Japanese. You know, the Italians were considered like dogs, entrance not allowed to Italians, blacks and dogs. And we were restudying the other day Native Americans. It's like, whoa. And again, I so appreciate what you said, Cindy, because at the beginning of the meeting, because if you go to DC, you know, you go to the African American Museum. I don't know if you've been there. It's worth the visit to DC alone. It's an amazing museum which walks you through it's in the shape of a ship, right? And you start from the bottom of the ship, which symbolizes and visually show you how people were transported from Africa, and it goes up. And the first few rounds, you really want to throw up. You know, it's horrible. You really throw up. And then as you go up, you know, you end up with African Americans in arts, sports, and so on, until you end up on a relief note. But it's like, whoa. And then you go to the Native American Museum, which is outrageous. It's a folklore museum. It's a folkloristic museum. It's so irritating. It makes me so angry every single time I go that I stopped. I was so angry. It's like, this is not a question of folklore. Just like the Europeans have not attuned for what they did with the colonies, Americans have started to attune with what they did to African Americans. They still need to attune on what they did on Mexicans, remember, 1 million sent back. And most of all, they still need to attune with what they've done on the Native Americans. That was horrible, right? So yes, I hear you, Carl. You're completely 100% right. But, you know, the reason why the US have had this more attractiveness for a long time were several. So first of all, World War II. World War II, the reality is that, well, the perception that World War I and World War II were won by the US, especially for what goes World War II. If you look at numbers, in reality, it was Russia who saved us, okay? Many more people died in the USSR than they did in America. But marketing means something, right? And while Putin does not stop occasion to remember that, what stuck with the image of people of the time was even my mother, you know, the Americans handing out chocolate bars, right? When they entered Paris, they were very careful about the choreography, having de Gaulle at the head of the group that entered there. But while the Russians did a lot of a dirty job and lots of people died, the Americans were there with the victory. They freed the country because Russia was mainly on the eastern part. And then the eastern part was under their brutal suppression, right? While Western Europe was essentially freed by the Americans, which gave us chocolate. If you ask any kid of the age of my mother, and they ask any older person of the age of my mother, who's 80 something, and you ask them what is their sweetest remembrance, it's mouthing that chocolate given by American GEOs. It was like Carrie, it stuck with their memories. And then what they did was to put a lot of money, and the US brought the best and the brightest over to the US and gave them an education. Political science as a discipline exists in Europe because the best and the brightest, from Oldmont, Verba to my Italian mentors, Amato, all of them came to the US to do their MA, or in several cases a PhD, which didn't exist in Europe at the time. very few countries had a doctorate. Germany was one of a few. Italy, for instance, didn't have PhDs until 30 years ago, 35 years ago, I think now. And then send them back. So this idea that in America you get the best of education stuck with people, right? And then you have Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood is, in my mind, the biggest tool of American public diplomacy. It gives an image of a US that doesn't exist. You know, Hollywood gives an image of what we would like to be. But people believe that. And also there is this thing which is extremely confusing when you actually move to the US as a foreigner. You know, you may have, the US is an extremely diverse country, diverse socioeconomically, geographically, traditions, everything. But at the eye, it, you know, you always see the same molds and people think it's very homogeneous. And you may have come here maybe for conferences or tourist trips and you speak the language and you see the movies and you come over here and you think, you know, the country is like, no. It weirdly, it took me much longer to get used. In Europe, wherever country I lived, from Norway to Portugal, to Belgium, after I learned the language, I knew how to manage personal relations. In the US, this has been much more complicated. So all things considered, no, we don't have a moral superiority, but people believe we do, or at least people believed we do because of some specific policies, some of which, like the scholarship, were, you know, smart policies. So, and that's why America was looked up so much. But that is finished. You know, it's like kaput and no more. And also the money the embassies put into them. I've seen them, you know, they pick on people. I have a couple of friends, you know, they talk, they give them money. They gave money to me when I was in Europe as well, I have to say. They give you money to organize conferences, do things like that, and you don't want to really speak ill of the US because they give you money. So you speak well, right? Which is not good as a scholar, but that's what happens.
Thank you so much again, Federiga, for a great and interesting and provocative talk for sure. Appreciate your intervention. We've run out of time now, but yeah, thanks again, and hope to see you all around the building sooner or later.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. I look forward to meeting you in person sooner or later, as Fernando said.
Thank
Bye.
you all.